Emmerdale villain Celia Daniels has made quite an impact during her short time in the village. From attempted murder and drug dealing to exploitation and fraud, her cruelty over the last 6 months has known no bounds. After terrorizing many of the locals, things have finally started to catch up to Celia, and she recently revealed her plan to flee the Dales with her son Ray Walters. The scheming duo have been plotting their move to Wrexham on New Year's Day, where they will scout out new victims to exploit. According to the Sun, Jay Griffiths, who plays the villain, has already filmed her final scenes on the soap, meaning Celia's reign of terror has officially come to an end. But while she won't be on our screens for much longer, her sinister actions will have a lasting impact on the village. Griffiths shared that she knew her time on the soap would be short-lived. "I knew it was finite, which I am very sad about because I would like to stay forever, but it's such a strong arc," she said. The actor addressed the recent modern slavery plot, which saw Bear Wolf had been the first to make anyone look, the strapping ex-boxer who had always favored honesty over subtlety. When Bear's smile dulled and his freedom narrowed to the same muddy fields and the same unending fetching of pallets and bags, people began to stitch together the ugly picture. April Windsor, young, fierce, inexplicably brave, saw things a little quicker than most. She had the bluntness of youth and the stubborn heart of someone who refused to be told she couldn't help. It started with a rumor and ended, by the time the police got involved, with statements and footage and a case file thick enough to bruise. But for Celia, rumors were part of the smoke and mirrors. She preferred to act swift, clinical, and devastating. When Dylan Penders, who'd been quietly chasing the story, uncovered a shard of evidence linking Celia and Ray to Bear's forced labor, Celia responded not with wordy denials but with plans. A flight to Wrexham on New Year's Day and a final, fierce sweep of the village to erase or silence anyone who could stop them. Ray Walters, Celia's son, was a smaller storm, all elbows and excuses. He could smile one moment and hurt someone the next. He looked up to his mother with a certain hungry reverence that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with survival. Where Celia was artful cruelty, Ray was impulsive violence, and together they were a dangerous toggle between cold calculation and reckless brutality. The farm itself had become a stage. Old barns, once home to livestock and damp hay, now smelled of bleach and fear. Lights were used to watch, not to celebrate. Cameras and coats of varnish camouflaged the parts of the property that had become traps. People worked, yes, under the watchful eyes of the Walters duo, but they worked in a fog of threats and bargaining, counting the hours until they either found a loophole or they didn't. When April realized Bear's life had been reduced to chores and fright, she did what she always did. She acted first and worried about the consequences later. She slipped onto the farm one night, the moon a pale coin in a velvet pocket, moving with a desperation that made her both brave and reckless. She found Bear in a dim corner of the yard, hands chapped and eyes hollower than she'd remembered. He'd been coaxed into believing escape would only lead to more retribution for those left behind. April begged him, her voice cracking and urgent. "Come with me," she pleaded. "We can get you out. We'll go to the police together. You don't have to." Bear's face was a map of reasons to stay. Memory, fear, loyalty, none of it rational, none of it fair. "If I leave," he said finally, "they'll punish the others. They'll look for me and they'll find them. I can't do that to people who can't fight." That resolve, noble and broken, was exactly what Celia expected. The villainess had staked everything on fear and leverage. It is easier to dominate a village when the people who could stop you are too frightened to speak. Celia watched the exchange from a doorway, a shadow that studied her prey the way a cat appraises a trapped mouse. Ray stood like a silhouette beside her, knuckles white around a spade handle. He was the kind of man who took pleasure in the immediate calculus of violence, solutions that required no courtrooms, no witnesses, only muscle and the right angle. "Kill her," Celia said, the words sliding from her like oil. "Do it quietly. Make it look like an accident." For a moment Ray's face was a stone ledger. He lowered the spade as if in sacrament. But the rhythm of the farm beat through him. He'd been trained, perhaps, to obey, but obedience and ruthlessness are not the same. Something twitching at the edges of his conscience. The only part of him that belonged to the child who once collected beetles in jam jars, wavered. April fled, as she had planned to do if Bear refused to go. She sprinted across the yard, breath ripping in and out, the chill air burning her lungs. She almost made it past the first hedgerow when a dog barked, an angry, panicked flare, and the night rolled back like a blanket. Celia was there faster than the barking, and Ray's hand found a stone as if it were an extension of his thought. What were you doing on my property, little fool? Celia's voice was syrupy laid over ice. Thinking you could steal my men? You should be careful. People have families. April's eyes were hard. You can't keep doing this. People are being hurt. People make choices, Celia said. Hard choices. Someone like you should know better than to choose for others. The spade's arc broke the knight's breath. The world smelled like iron. April crumpled, the hedgerow catching at her sleeve. For a second the world spun. Celia's face closing in, Ray's guilt like a tide bears soundless hands at his sides. Then another sound cut through. The squeal of tires on shingle and the harsh, very human shout of a man's voice. Dylan Penders hadn't left the case to chance. He had chased every lead and carried every note like talismans. He had tapped into the village's network of gossip and fear, and he had, at last, a piece of sound that made the hairs on his neck stand up. The recorded confession of one of Celia's enforcers, found by a sympathetic farmhand who had been threatened into silence. Dylan arrived with 2 local policemen, breathless and determined, and at the sight of the flashing lights, the scene dissolved into chaos. Celia's face was the mask of someone who had been in control and found control slipping out of her fingers. She moved with the efficiency of a woman who had rehearsed departures in her bed at 3 a.m. Documents were grabbed, cash stuffed into pockets, a small, battered suitcase hauled from an attic. Ray, half in revolt and half in panic, tried to barricade the barn doors. "We have to go," he yelled. "Now!" But when the police shouted and the officers spilled into the yard, the illusion crumbled. One by one, the forced workers stepped forward, not because they were certain they could win, but because someone else had given them courage, because Dylan had recorded, because April had run, because Bear had refused to leave, and because the villagers had had enough. Arrest is never cinematic in the way television imagines. It's bureaucratic and small and brutal in the particulars. Handcuffs, reading of rights, the clink of doors in a van. Celia's final scenes were shot like an elegy to her own arrogance. On set, the cameras captured a woman who was not quite a monster and never quite a victim. Someone whose dangerous brilliance had been fed by a cold, persistent hunger to bend a world she found soft. As the police escorted her away, she looked back at the village not with regret, but with something that might be called calculation even in defeat. There were always other places to go, other barns to buy, other people to exploit. Wrexham might not be free of her, but for now the village breathed. Inside the police van, Ray whimpered, a small sound that suggested he'd never been certain he could be anything other than his mother's echo. He had been useful because he had been ruthless when ordered, because he listened to the one voice above all others. In the interrogation room, he sputtered excuses that sounded thin even to his own ears. He had watched Celia nourish him on pragmatism and fear, but when the cameras rolled and the questions cut into him, his mother's voice in his head was suddenly one more accusation among many. It is a peculiar thing to be taught that fear is triumph. When the world turns and fear becomes evidence, the lessons look fragile. The legal machinery took its course. The villagers who had been exploited gave statements that were shaky and strong in turns. Bear's testimony was quieter than anyone expected, and the sort of honesty that strips a person bare. He told the courts how he'd been approached in a moment of weakness, how jobs become shackles, how promises to help are sometimes bottles thrown into a sea of needs. Dylan's recordings, April's eyewitness account, and a cache of documents turned out to be the backbone of the case. Celia had tried to run, to smear and discredit, but crimes rooted in everyday cruelty leave trails, witnesses, ledgers, and the stubborn arc of conscience in those who had been pushed to the edge. For April, the aftermath was messy and complicated. She wanted a clear, cinematic victory. The villain hauled away, the village healed. Real life is less tidy. There were hospital visits, counseling sessions, a community meeting where people cried into tissues and attempted to explain how they would rebuild trust. April's bravery was lauded, yes, but at a cost. She had been struck, she had been silenced for a moment where the world could have been changed, and it took the combined force of a few brave or tired people to ensure she did not become another tragic footnote. Celia's final scenes, the ones Jay Griffiths filmed, were not merely physical. They were a study in certainty unraveling. On camera, she stood in the doorway of her farmhouse, suitcase in hand and face lit with a brittle equation. What is left when power goes? Griffiths gave her the texture of someone who could be both magnetic and repellent, an actress who understood the difference between showing cruelty and making it feel human. In interviews, she would later say she had known her arc was finite. There was relief in the knowledge, a kind of gratitude even, for having a role that asked difficult questions. In the story, Celia knew that she had burned her bridges and lit the fields behind her on purpose. Her exit was designed not to be a fade-out but an eruption. The courtroom hearing became a kind of village theater, the gallery full of people who once feared being noticed. There was satisfaction in their participation, but also a recognition that justice does not always tidy the interior. The judge spoke plainly about exploitation and power, about the law's blunt instrument trying to exact measurable harm for the unmeasurable pain of diminished lives. Celia's sentencing was the sort of thing that rings like a bell long after the gavel falls, a balance of penalties calibrated to the severity of her actions. She was removed from the community's physical landscape, but the psychological traces would remain. In the quiet that followed, the village had to reckon with the small, necessary work that comes after collapse. The farm was handed over to temporary stewardship. The people who had been worked to the bone needed space to mend and to find work that did not come with strings. Dylan kept writing. His notebook had become a ledger of names he couldn't forget. Bear took to walking by the river at dawn with a slow steadiness, the kind that comes when a man finally allows himself to breathe. April, scarred but no less fierce, started to speak at school meetings and community groups about signs of coercion and exploitation. Her voice had been loud in the quiet spaces where young people judged their options, and now she used that volume as a tool, a warning, and a shield. As for Celia, her story did not end with the clack of prison gates. In court documents and prison forums, the case became a cautionary tale. People debated whether she deserved the fate she received or whether the root problems that fed her actions, poverty, desperation, and a system that makes exploitation profitable, were the real villains. In conversations around kitchen tables and in the coffee machine queue at the post office, the village came to understand that naming a villain was a start but not the whole work. When the cameras left, when Jay Griffiths stepped away from the final take, there was a hush that felt both like grief and like relief. Griffiths had known the role was a stretch, an arc that would burn bright and then be gone. She had given Celia a voice that was several shades of dangerous and a tenderness so chilling it became complicit. The fans would write about the exit, tabloids would run the footage and linger over lines that had hurt to deliver. But in the village the next morning, the focus was quieter. On dinners, on chores, on the small acts of rebuilding that never make headlines but that stitch up seams. There remains, even after such a dramatic unspooling, the knowledge that someone like Celia could find purchase elsewhere. Evil is a weather pattern and it moves. But Emmerdale, scarred and solid, had been reminded of its own resilience. The way people protect one another when push comes to shove, the way a single recording or a single brave teenage girl can unpick the tapestry of a carefully maintained lie. In the end, the story was not only about a villain who had finally filmed her last scenes, but about the long, necessary rehearsal of a community learning to recognize its own strengths again. And April, dirty, bruised, stubborn, watched the sunrise one morning from the hill above the village. She had wanted a clean victory and instead got a messy, real aftermath. She thought of Bear, of Dylan, of the mothers who had looked at her the night before and seen someone who had been willing to risk everything. A hollow feeling of fatigue settled in her shoulders, but with it came a prickling sense of purpose. Villains could be driven out for a time. People, once seen, could find paths back to themselves. Celia's reign had ended not because she suddenly decided to stop, but because the village chose, at last, to stop being afraid. The microphones and the court transcripts would keep the story alive in the columns and the recollections. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Emmerdale Echoes.